Nutrition Hero Podcast. Igniting both the art and the science of functional medicine. Here's your host, Dr. Brad Watts.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Nutrition Hero Podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Watts, and I have to say, Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving to one and all. I appreciate what we've been able to accomplish over the last year with the podcast, the people we've met, and the lives that we've been able to inspire, and my goodness, all the patients that get the effect of having inspired clinicians. I love it. So anyway, something about this time of year that when you sit and remember and you're thankful and you're looking back at all the stuff, it's a good time of year. I appreciate it. So anyway, with that in mind, today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about a fat problem. I call it a big fat problem, but really what we're going to be discussing is an undercover condition, a condition that's affecting many thousands, millions of Americans, and largely goes unchecked. And no, I'm not talking about biotoxin, right? No, we're not talking about biotoxin. By the way, how cool was that podcast? Hopefully you guys all had an opportunity to listen to that. If you haven't, go back and listen to the previous episode with Dr. Heather Crater talking about biotoxin illness and some of the things that she's seeing in practice that are being exposed in the functional medicine world. My goodness, some cool stuff. So anyway, check that out. Check her out at her links there. And very cool opportunity to help patients by looking at biotoxin illness. Man, even in my own family, I've been able to see that. It's pretty awesome. So on to today, though. We're talking about a big fat problem. We're actually going to be talking about fatty liver disease and its different forms that it takes as it progresses. So we're going to dig in on that. If you're new to the podcast, make sure you hit subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, however you get your media. If you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, hit subscribe. We appreciate every single one of you for participating as part of the Nutrition Hero family, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. So anyway, let's get at it. A big fat problem is how we start. Remember that with chronic disease, we talk about any chronic condition, diabetes, thyroid disease, blood pressure, cholesterol, etc. The genesis of chronic disease is always genetics plus your lifestyle or your environmental factors, right? Genetics and lifestyle. Now, modern medicine really likes to talk about environment, right, as if it's a passive situation where you don't have any control over it. However, it's not exactly like that. We're going to lump environment into lifestyle or lifestyle into environment. They're going to be both the same thing. They're both the same thing. And so genetics plus lifestyle gives you your chronic health outcome, whether it be good or bad. You could have terrible genetics, a quality lifestyle, and still be healthy. You could have awesome genetics, a really poor lifestyle, really poor environmental factors, like living under power lines or something, and end up with much different chronic disease scenario than somebody else. And so anyway, genetics and lifestyle give you your chronic health outcomes. You have to start there, because if you don't start there, then everybody's a victim. If everybody's a victim, it's rough going in the healthcare landscape. So anyway, genetics and lifestyle, or genetics and environment, are key. Now, last week we did discuss how your genetics, if you're susceptible to biotoxins and you have biotoxins in your environment or as part of your lifestyle because of the food you're eating and the beverages you're drinking, that's going to lead you down the road to some very specific conditions. And it's no different here. This is a template that you can apply across the board, a template that you can apply not to just your patients, but seeing your patients through this lens is going to be key. So don't ever forget that genetics and lifestyle give you your chronic health outcomes. And it has to be that way in order for us to help patients move in the right direction. That's the viewpoint of our assessment, because we're not going to fix the genetics. You can obviously modulate what genetics get expressed, but the genes are the genes. It's the lifestyle that has to match your current genetic makeup. So anyway, let's not kick a dead horse any further here. But let's talk about the flow of fat and chronic metabolic disease, as really the genesis of fatty liver disease is the main topic of the day today. So it starts at the bottom. I call it obscene fat intake. Obscene, not just because of volume for most people, but it could also be obscene because of the type of fat, saturated fatty acids. I think about the fast food lifestyle, and I think about how the fast food lifestyle is really a passive lifestyle. I heard an ad today. I was listening to the radio, like the whatever it's called, Pandora. There's an ad that came on, and it said, get McDonald's delivered to your front door. And I was like, what in the world? What kind of world are we living in where fast food's not fast enough? It has to be fast and passive food. Or fast and passive food. What in the world? Anyway, obscene saturated fat intake is typically where this starts. And over time, if you have genetics that are predisposed to dysglycemia or predisposed to developing large amounts of reactive oxygen species, we end up with dysglycemia. We end up with insulin resistance as a protective mechanism. And that's really the only result that you can expect from an overload of calorie balance, so calories in versus calories out. Even if they're clean, even if you're vegetable based, if you're eating 2,000 more calories a day than you're actually expending, what do you think the result is going to be? It's going to be mitochondrial damage, it's going to be mitochondrial defect, it's going to be insulin resistance showing up to protect your body from cell death. It's just going to happen. That's what it's going to be. So, and I laugh because it's a logical conclusion, and when it comes to healthcare, it's like people don't want to be logical about it. It's, anything but change your lifestyle. Anything. Oh yeah, your genetics, your body's just breaking down. Your body's breaking down because of what you're making it carry. It's crazy. So anyway, that insulin resistance leads us to impaired fatty acid metabolism, and impaired fatty acid metabolism is really the onset of something that we would call steatosis or triglyceride accumulation. Now, because your liver is basically a big filter for your bloodstream, like an air filter is on your furnace, whatever's cruising around in the air in your furnace, getting sucked in from outside or blown around through the house, is going to have to go through that filter. Whatever's cruising around in your bloodstream is going to have to go through the filter of your liver. And if we have massive triglyceride accumulation because of our impaired fatty acid metabolism, you can imagine that the liver is going to be exposed to a large amount of fat. Makes sense. When we have this steatosis, this triglyceride accumulation, the problem shows up when the triglycerides start to infiltrate the hepatocytes themselves. Not just going through the bloodstream, but going and getting caught in the filter itself. And just like the air filter gets clogged and you change it at some point, otherwise the air, the rate of airflow in your house, if we can give it a term, goes down if your filter's dirty. Same deal happens with your liver. Same deal. Now, it causes this continuation of oxidative stress, and it leads us down the road toward fibrosis. Now, when oxidative stress, reactive oxygen species, starts to pile up inside of a hepatocyte, we get a fibrotic change. And instead of apoptosis, or the cells just dying, what happens is the fibrotic changes take place, and we decrease liver function. The structure remains, but not functional. And so we get, on like histology slides, you're going to actually get this fibrosis appearance that tends to happen over the portal vein. Now, when we get to this fibrotic change, typically if it's a genetic and lifestyle issue not associated with, like Budweiser, what happens is the doctor is going to diagnose a patient with something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a grouping of different factors. And so if we look at like his research article that I'm going to quote here, it says the pathogenetic processes of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and its progression are multifactorial and influenced by both environmental and genetic factors. Well, right? Like we haven't talked about that for 30 years in the natural healthcare world. So when we look at steatosis, triglyceride accumulation, moving up toward non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, really what we're talking about is infiltration to injury. Infiltration, you're not going to get diagnosed with NAFLD. It's really when we have injury and we start to have the fibrotic changes taking place that we start to see NAFLD show up in a diagnostic world. Now, your patients on the continuum of healthy liver to NAFLD, that might be 12 years. It might be 30 years. It might be 2 years. Like, this is important to understand, that these changes are happening for a decade before it actually shows up as a diagnosis in the patient's medical chart. And it's amazing that it takes decades. It's amazing when you consider living that fast food passive lifestyle of McDonald's delivery. That's amazing that it takes decades to show up. So from infiltration to injury is really what this is all about. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease will take a long time to show up. However, its signs and symptoms will be there long before the diagnosis. This is so important for functional medicine providers to understand, because this is something that inevitably you're going to see in your practice, especially when I show you some of the statistics here coming up. It's crazy. So anyway, when we look at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, it remains a diagnosis of exclusion, and it's not really a diagnosis made apart from ruling out other things. So here's what happens. The doctor shows up, looks at your chart, and they say, well, you're not a drinker, so it can't be alcoholic liver cirrhosis. Okay, thanks, doc. Well, we know that it's not hepatitis. All right, thanks, doc. So what does that leave us? Well, I know you've been living that fast food lifestyle for a few decades, and I know that genetically you're predisposed to making larger amounts of cholesterol, so let's call it fatty liver disease and move on. And that's typically what happens. So it's made by eliminating other diseases from your differential. And so this is interesting, because for me, if you just have fatty liver, right, that's a large percentage of the population. Like, some of the medical literature says up to 40% of the population is dealing with fatty liver disease at some point in their life. That's a massive amount of people. 300 million Americans, and you got 40% that are going to have that as a diagnosis at some point in their lifestyle. Man, you tell me we're not living like kings in this country. And anyway, so looking at this, when you look at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease as an infiltration to injury situation, that begs the question, what's the difference between just infiltration and ultimate injury? And I'm so glad you asked, because the bridge between infiltration and injury is inflammation. It's inflammation. It's that ongoing chronic inflammatory situation, that ongoing exposure, if we want to call it that, ongoing exposure to things that are going to continue oxidative stress. So let's say you have fatty liver disease, and you decide you're going to be a marathon runner, right? But you're not going to clean up any of your reactive oxygen species or any of the stuff that's been happening, right? I'm just going to go be a marathon runner, like Biggest Loser style. 300 pounds, I'm going to start working out 6 hours a day and wonder why I feel like garbage, partway through. Well, when we look at oxidative stress, remember, a side effect of oxidative stress is apoptosis, cell death. And cell death in a liver situation is going to happen with fibrotic changes and ultimately perhaps even cirrhosis. And so anyway, so inflammation's the bridge between infiltration and injury. So if you have infiltration, that's not the end of the world. It becomes identifying it as infiltration, elevated AST, ALT, GGT, elevated triglycerides on your blood chemistry. If you can identify it at that point, there's an opportunity for you to reverse it before it becomes this massive chronic injury situation. That's pretty cool if you think about it, but you got to catch it, and that's what functional medicine providers are for. You got to catch it. So anyway, inflammation's the name of the game there. So cleaning up reactive oxygen species is something ultimately that we've talked about ad nauseum, I think, and at least I feel like we have. But it's so important, I keep mentioning it over and over. You got to vacuum up metabolic dust, reactive oxygen species with antioxidants, and if you don't, you will be living under insulin resistance at some point. It's going to happen. So anyway, same deal when we talk about infiltration to injury. with liver function. Now, the major functions of the liver, remember, are biotransformation. So think phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification. You take something that's fat soluble, turn it into something that's water soluble. That would be an example of biotransformation. That's issue number 1 with the liver. That's function number 1, rather. Function number 2 is storage. You're looking at storing vitamins, glycogen, lipids, that type of stuff. Function number 3 is synthesis. We're creating tons of proteins and growth factors and waste products like urea, etc. Like biotransformation, storage, and synthesis. The one that we always think about with the liver is biotransformation, liver detoxification. What's really interesting is that liver detoxification tends to wave bye-bye when the storage function of the liver takes over. So think about it in this term of mechanics. If we have lipid storage taking place inside of a cell to the extent that we would consider it fatty infiltration, that's going to handicap the liver's ability to synthesize any proteins, etc., that it needs to. And it's certainly going to handicap the liver's ability to work phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification mechanisms in the biotransformation function of the liver. Absolutely. Think, how much work do you want to do when you're stuffed with fat? Like, tomorrow is going to be Thanksgiving. In the United States, Thanksgiving is a festival of sport. And the sport, it's not just the football you're going to watch, it's the eating that takes place. So think about this tomorrow after you're like on plate number 3 and slice of pie number 3. Think about how much work are you willing to do right now when you're that loaded with caloric intake. Not much. Really, all you want to do is go sit on the couch and watch the Cowboys and the Lions or whoever's playing tomorrow. Right? That's it. And that is the same situation your liver's in, and your liver doesn't even have a brain. So this is amazing. So when you are looking at a liver that's been loaded up with lipids, triglycerides, the amount of work it wants to do on its other functions goes down. Part of it is because of capacity, but also part of it is that if you think about it from an energy perspective, if my liver is allotted 100 energy units a day, right? Which, again, this is kind of this is a weird hypothetical, but just follow me on this. If my liver is allotted 100 energy units a day by my brain, and it's spending 98 of them on trying to make sure it doesn't choke and die on the amount of triglycerides that are coming in, is there any amount of energy left for biotransformation or synthesis of protein? No. Right? And I think that you get the point there. But a weird analogy, but you get the point. Now, when we're looking at the mechanism of this overall, we want to think about how to assess fatty liver with patients. Now, you heard me mention AST, ALT, GGT. You heard me mention triglycerides. You heard me mention maybe some syndrome X characteristics to your patient base. But I want to look a little bit further than that. I want you to look at from a genetic perspective. Now, one of the things that we've talked about, I think, on the podcast in the past is using Dr. Ben Lynch's program that he has where you take a strategene report. So you get your DNA from 23andMe or whatever, and you get a strategene report that gives you an interpretation of some detoxification pathways. There's a specific detoxification pathway called the transulfuration. I shouldn't say detox, a biochemistry pathway. But this biochem pathway called the transulfuration is part of detoxification. This is where we see glutathione oxidized into its 2 metabolites and then recycled back into a reduced form of glutathione. This is where you have hydrogen peroxide molecule that's participating in that. This is also where GGT comes into play. One of the things that happens is you see a patient that genetically looks like they're predisposed to not being able to use glutathione. Maybe they have a genetic SNP that doesn't allow them to oxidize glutathione the right way. That would be a handicap in a detoxification perspective, right? And maybe not a handicap. Maybe it's just a suppression of your patient's ability to have normal detox. Whatever you want to label it, understand that it's decreased function because of genetics. Now, one of the things that happens when you can't oxidize glutathione appropriately is it has to be transported from the cell. One of the transporters is GGT. So if you see elevated GGT on your blood chemistry, you're not automatically thinking like, oh, this patient's diseased, what are we going to do? One of the things you're thinking about is potentially they just can't oxidize glutathione, and we have to have transport, which is what GGT is for, and maybe that's why we're looking at this. Well, what's one of the reasons why we can't have appropriate oxidation of glutathione? Glutathione, remember, it takes place or takes part, one of its mechanisms of action is going to be in the phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification mechanisms. Now, when we look at our phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification mechanisms and that glutathione's not doing its job, are we completing? Hard for me to get that word out. Are we completing any of the biotransformation that needs to take place in order to get rid of xenobiotics or drug residues, or even to process glucose, even to process, think heavy metal, mercury? Are we going to be working any of those phase 1 and 2 liver detox processes if our cells are loaded with lipids and we can't oxidize glutathione? And so just follow me on this rapid trail here. GGT is going to be high. GGT is going to be high. And we see that, and the patient goes, well, you immediately think, do you have a gallbladder, patient? Well, no, I had it taken out in 2005, and the reason they had it taken out in 2005 is because everybody's telling them to eat fat-free in the 90s, and you don't have fat, you can't put a demand on bile, and so bile turns into sludge, and it just sits in there and solidifies in the gallbladder, okay? So that happened. Now we have GGT that's elevated because of the gallbladder situation. Now we have GGT that's elevated because genetically they can't process glutathione, they can't oxidize it to use it, and the patients live in the McDonald's lifestyle. This is not far off from a typical diabetes patient, you guys. This is not far off, okay? It sounds drastic because it took me 5 minutes to get all that out, but this is not far off. This is something that you would want to consider as a common mechanism. Very common. Now, when we look at being able to support these patients, obviously we want to do something that has the effect of a fat flush. The fat flush is not an avoidance of fat. The fat flush is getting the body to spend fat for fuel once again. And this is so amazing when we talk about improving liver function, because once you're in that spot where NAFLD has turned into something maybe worse, like NASH, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, where you actually have cirrhosis starting to show up, at that point, we're not going to be flushing the liver to improve those cells that have died. They're gone. They're not coming back, okay? However, but we can improve the rest of the liver's function. The rest of the cells that are there, choking on the lipids because the body's not using them for fuel, you're just storing them. It's amazing. It's amazing. We can improve that function. How do we improve that function? With some of the classic hepatic clearing herbs that we would talk about. Biogenetics does some awesome work with that stuff. And then also supporting the body's ability to manage distribution of fat, stored fat, triglycerides. It's amazing to see patients go through metabolic clearing phases like Deluxe Metabolic Clearing Kit, and if they have steatohepatitis already, being able to substitute out HepatoCL, HepatoClear, and put in HepatoST, right, for the steatosis problem. And it's amazing. It's amazing to see. I love it, especially if you're moving your patients toward more of a ketogenic lifestyle where they're living in a mild ketosis, spending fat for fuel, and dampening the amount of glucose that gets burned. This is a good step in the right direction. So typically, if I have a patient that's in this spot, what am I going to do? I'm going to put them through 2 Deluxe Metabolic Clearing Kits, add in HepatoST, get rid of the HepatoCL for those 2 kits, and promote proper function by supporting the dietary recommendation as such. So it's amazing. It's amazing. Anyway, just wanted to do a few minutes here with you guys on how to look at these fatty liver changes, and it's something that you're constantly going to be seeing walk through your door in clinical practice. Now, when you look at this, You always have to remember, think the same thing I started out with, you always have to remember that genetics and lifestyle, or the patient's environment that they place their genetics in, gives them their chronic health outcome. So if you see fatty liver disease and somebody goes, I have NASH, I have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, you can't be down in the dumps right away, right? So the quick story about this is, I think it was like my second patient, literally, I think it was like my second patient in practice ever. And she walks into my office, and I didn't meet patients until they showed up for treatment, right? I wasn't part of the admissions process. So what happens is a patient shows up in my office, and she's like crying. Her husband's upset, and he's holding her hand, and I'm like, oh my goodness, does she have cancer or something? She just find out that she has cancer, and they're like, I have NASH. Okay, it was confirmed on like needle aspiration, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So that's past an AFLD, where the doctors didn't recommend any lifestyle change, and they just let this lady's lifestyle and genetics combine to move her from the infiltration to the injury stage. Okay, and so anyway, I'm sitting there as a new doctor. I think I'm like 27 years old, 26 years old, and sitting there going, oh man, 26. What am I going to do? Right? This lady is crying. I'm trying to not let my emotions get sucked up by hers. That's an interesting dynamic. And so what do? The only thing I know how to do at that point, we're going to start monkeying around with a lifestyle. We're going to start moving the lifestyle in the right direction. I didn't know any of the genetic information. I understood phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification mechanisms. I understood that just because the liver is destroyed in some parts of it, you still have a liver. It's still functioning. They didn't transplant you yet. So let's get after it. And so we put her through the version of a metabolic clearing kit that I was using at that point. And guess what happened? Her transaminases, AST, ALT, GGT, went down. Went down so far that she didn't believe that it was accurate. She goes to her primary care doctor. They retest the stuff, and they're like, what in the world? How did this happen? And I got excited, right? And in my juvenile doctoring state, I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. We're reversing this condition. Not the thing you want to say to somebody that's already been married to a chronic condition, right? And so anyway, what we found in that case, and what I'm telling you now that we've seen thousands of times since, is that just because somebody's experiencing the fibrotic changes or even the cirrhosis changes with their liver doesn't mean that you can't improve the function of the hepatocytes that are left. It's amazing. It's amazing. So very important, because ultimately these patients are told, you're going to die with this condition, right? And they will. They'll die with the diagnosis, right? But it doesn't have to be tomorrow. Doesn't have to be tomorrow. The only thing right now that's happening in modern medicine is patients are getting this medication like, have you heard of, I can't remember what it's called. Is it lipozine? Anyway, what it does is it improves fat metabolism, and they're getting this medication trying to improve their fat metabolism instead of making their metabolism metabolize fat. Doesn't that, like, logically, it should just make sense, and for some reason it doesn't. Crazy. So what happens with these patients is they get put on the liver transplant list after they end up seeing some of the fibrotic changes occur. And it's just a wait-and-see situation. Not cool. Not cool. What they really need is they need to be exposed to somebody like you that has the capacity to think critically about genetics and lifestyle and figure out how do we improve function. Because really, it's not about getting rid of disease, is it? No, it's about improving function, and by improving function, the disease starts to fade. And that's the key. That's the key. All right. Thank you guys for listening here today. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, b@drbradwatts.com. If you'd like to be on the list that goes out with research, if you'd like to be on the list that goes out, I call it a clinical should know. Every week, typically, you're going to get an email, and it's something that has been observed in clinical practice that you can use in yours right away, so you don't have to go through thousands of patients and a decade of wins and losses in order to learn these hard-fought, hard-won lessons. So, anyway, All right. Thank you guys for listening. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Blessings.